Defenders of the received view standardly take constituency to be parthood. So suppose constituency is parthood. Then the received view implies, in light of the above cases, that for some proposition P and some numerically distinct proposition Q, following: Q is a part of P and P is a part of Q. But this implication is false. It's false because the following principle about parthood is true. Principle on your handout: antisymmetry of parthood. For all x and all y, if x is a part of y and y is a part of x, then x is identical with y. I'm not saying it's 100% uncontroversial, I'm just saying it's true. Because the received view has the false implication just noted, the received view itself is false. That's my fifth argument against the received view. You might deny that constituency is exactly the same thing as parthood. Some might claim instead that constituency is sort of really analogous to parthood. A version of my fifth argument against the received view can still be run. For if constituency is analogous to parthood, I would say that that analogy consists, at least in part, in the truth of the following principle. That is, the antisymmetry of constituency, handout again, for all x and all y, if x is a constituent of y and y is a constituent of x, then x is identical with y. So whether or not constituency is identical with parthood, the received view implication that two numerically distinct propositions can be constituents of each other is false. And so I conclude that the received view is false. And I'll stop.
Thank you. And now we will hear a response by David van der Laan.
Well, I'm in a tight spot. Trenton has launched a relentless barrage of arguments, each of them transparently valid for a thesis that I myself was inclined to affirm to begin with. What's a commentator to do? Well, one strategy would be to invent an alter ego and then to deliver my comments in the persona of that alter ego. I have to confess that didn't even occur to me until last night. Fortunately, there are some other options. So what I will do is to develop the line of objections that seems to be the greatest threat to Merricks' arguments, and that's the line of objections motivated by serious actualism. The initial statement of the objection is this: if a proposition is directly about an entity, then that proposition bears a relation to that entity. But serious actualism entails that nothing is related to a non-existent entity, since there are no non-existent entities. So no proposition can be directly about an entity that does not exist. But if this is so and the received view is true, then premises 7, G, and Roman 7 each presuppose something false, since they presuppose that singular propositions can be directly about non-existent entities. Premise 7, for example, is this: if the received view is true, then Lincoln is a constituent of the proposition that Lincoln does not exist. This premise presupposes that the proposition that Lincoln does not exist is a singular proposition about Lincoln and thus directly about Lincoln. Merricks shares the objector's commitment to serious actualism, but he thinks that the objection fails because it depends on the aboutness assumption, which is on your handout. Necessarily, if a proposition is directly about an individual, then that proposition stands in a relation to that individual. Merricks gives us two arguments against the aboutness assumption, one that involves individual essences and another that involves a positive characterization of what it is for a proposition to be directly about something. Let's look at each of these and consider how a serious actualist who is drawn toward the received view might reply. Merricks' first argument against the aboutness assumption invites us to consider Lincolnicity, an individual essence of Lincoln. In some possible worlds, Lincolnicity is unexemplified, so in some worlds the proposition that Lincolnicity is not exemplified is true. It seems to follow that in such worlds, the proposition that Lincoln does not exist is true. The proposition that Lincoln does not exist is a singular proposition about Lincoln. Given serious actualism, this proposition stands in no relation to Lincoln. Therefore, it is possible for a proposition to be directly about something without being directly related to that thing, contrary to the aboutness assumption. How might the defender of the received view reply? One tack would be to deny Merricks' assumption that in some possible worlds, Lincolnicity is not exemplified, and to deny its consequence that in some possible worlds, the proposition that Lincoln does not exist is true. The idea is not that Lincoln exists in all possible worlds, but that in worlds in which he does not exist, Lincolnicity and the proposition that Lincoln does not exist do not exist either. Such an approach might be motivated by serious actualism, and in fact, Robert Adams has proposed something very much like this. Adams defines a thisness as the property of being identical to some particular individual. Clearly, any thisness will be an essence of any individual that instantiates it. Adams writes, "It's hard to see how an actualist," and he does mean serious actualist there, "could consistently maintain that there is a thisness of a non-actual individual. For if there were one, it would be the property of being identical with that individual. To be the property of being identical with a particular individual is to stand, primitively, in a unique relation with that individual. It would be absurd to suppose that being the property of being identical with me could be a purely internal feature of my thisness, not implying any relation to me." End quote. Adams goes on to argue that singular propositions are in the same boat. Since to be a singular proposition is to involve a certain individual directly, it is also to stand in a relation to that individual. And so, given serious actualism, it's not possible for such a proposition to be directly about a non-actual individual. Adams illustrates this view with a theological image. Picture God deciding whether to create anything. God considers his options, among them the exemplification of various qualities in various ways. But is there, in addition, the option of creating one individual rather than another qualitatively identical to it? Could God have decided to create one of Max Black's indiscernible iron spheres, that is, one of the two in particular? God can, certainly, create a sphere with the requisite qualities, but after that, what else is left to do? If necessarily there are no essences of non-actual individuals, then in any possible world in which Lincoln does not exist, Lincolnicity does not exist. But then Merricks' assumption that there are possible worlds in which Lincolnicity is not exemplified is false. Likewise, on this view of the proposition that Lincoln does not exist is a singular proposition about Lincoln, then it does not exist in any worlds in which Lincoln does not exist. And in that case, it's open to the serious actualist to adopt the received view. The individuals that singular propositions are directly about are components of those propositions. So if there are no unexemplified essences, Merricks' first argument against the aboutness assumption fails. But there is a second argument as well. Being directly about something, according to characterizations given by both Plantinga and Adams, has a positive element and a negative element. The positive element is the one that concerns us. Merricks calls it being appropriately about. A proposition that is directly about something is appropriately about that thing. Now, what is it to be appropriately about something? Merricks observes that there's a perfectly evident way in which the proposition that there are no carnivorous cows is about carnivorous cows. But since there are no carnivorous cows, it must be that a proposition can be about something in this evident way, even if there is no such thing. To be appropriately about something, Merricks suggests, is to be about something in this evident way. And so a proposition can be appropriately about something that does not exist. In this case, the aboutness assumption is false. An actualist defender of the received view will most likely decline Merricks' invitation to understand being appropriately about as being about in the evident way. That is to say, the defender of the received view may simply deny one of Merricks' premises. But she would do even better to provide another way of understanding being appropriately about that implies that the aboutness assumption is true. The natural thought here is that appropriate aboutness is itself a relation, specifically a connection or link or correspondence between a propositional content and some object, that is to say, some existing object. Both Adams and Williamson imply that aboutness is a relation. That was clear in the quotations that Trenton read. And the idea is not difficult to appreciate. It's not even grammatical to say that a proposition is simply about, full stop. It needs to be about something. Aboutness cries out for a second relatum. The defender of the received view could say the same of what Merricks calls appropriate aboutness. If she were right, the aboutness assumption would be true. But hasn't Merricks already given us counterexamples to the aboutness assumption? Isn't it just obvious that the proposition that there are no carnivorous cows is about carnivorous cows? Here, I think the defender of the received view may plausibly deny that it's obvious. She may say that such a proposition is about the world, or perhaps about no object